The ocean has always been a realm of mystery and danger, a vast expanse where courage and catastrophe collide. But few shipwrecks have shaken the world like the one we're about to explore. A disaster so profound it didn't just claim lives, it changed history itself. Picture a storm of unimaginable fury, waves towering like skyscrapers, and a ship swallowed whole by the sea, vanishing into the abyss. For decades, its fate was a ghost story whispered among sailors, a puzzle no one could solve. Until now, this isn't just the story of a ship lost to the depths. It's the story of how a single tragedy forced humanity to rethink everything we knew about the sea. When this ship went down, it didn't just take its crew with it, it dragged down centuries of flawed assumptions about navigation, safety, and even the laws that govern the oceans. The wreckage became a grim classroom, revealing mistakes that had gone unnoticed for generations. But here's the twist: the most shocking secrets weren't found in the wreck itself. They emerged in the courtrooms and laboratories, where experts pieced together a truth so startling it rewrote the rules of the sea. Imagine a discovery so powerful it sparked international debates, reshaped maritime laws, and saved countless lives in the centuries that followed. That's the legacy of this shipwreck. So why does this matter to you? Because hidden in this story are lessons about human ingenuity, resilience, and the cost of progress. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. And as we dive into the depths of this mystery, you'll see how the echoes of that fateful night still ripple through our world today. From the eerie silence of the ocean floor to the heated debates that reshaped nations, we're about to uncover the secrets that have been waiting for centuries to be told. This is more than a history lesson. It's a journey into the heart of one of the sea's greatest enigmas and the incredible impact it left behind. The night the ship met its doom was one of those rare moments when nature flexed its full, terrifying power. Winds howled like a chorus of ghosts tearing at the sails with unseen hands. Waves, black as ink and taller than castles, slammed into the hull with such force that seasoned sailors wept. The crew fought desperately, muscles burning as they wrestled with ropes gone slick with seawater, their shouts barely audible over the storm's roar. But the sea was merciless. In one final, crushing act, the ship was hurled onto jagged rocks, wood splintering like matchsticks, the deck buckling under the weight of the ocean's wrath. Within minutes, the vessel that had once been a triumph of human engineering was swallowed whole, leaving only wreckage and whispers. What makes this tragedy different from countless others lost to the deep? It wasn't just the scale of the disaster, it was the shockwaves it sent through the world. This was no ordinary merchant ship or fishing vessel. It carried not just lives but ideas. Innovations that were supposed to make sailing safer, promises that had lulled people into forgetting the sea's cruelty. When it sank, it took with it the illusion that humanity had tamed the oceans. The wreckage became proof of something far more unsettling, that progress could be fragile and confidence could be deadly. Among the drowned were men whose names would later echo in history books, not for how they died, but for how their deaths forced the living to change. One was a young naval architect who had scribbled notes about a radical new hull design. Another, a wealthy investor who had mocked calls for lifeboats, calling them unnecessary weight. Their stories, frozen in time, became warnings. The wreck didn't just end lives, it exposed arrogance, flawed laws, and the grim cost of ignoring the sea's lessons. And then there were the survivors, those few who clung to splintered wood in the freezing water, praying for dawn. Their testimonies would ignite outrage. They spoke of locked doors below deck, of lifeboats too few for half the passengers, of a captain who vanished when the first wave hit. These weren't just tales of survival, they were indictments. The world listened, horrified, as the survivors laid bare the failures that had turned a storm into a slaughter. This was the shipwreck that refused to be forgotten. Because when the waves finally stilled and the funerals ended, the real storm began. One of protests, investigations, and a demand for answers. The wreck didn't just sink a ship, it sank an entire era of complacency. And from its wreckage, something new would rise: laws, technologies, and a humility that would save generations to come. The sea had taught its lesson. This time, humanity was finally ready to listen. To understand the full weight of this tragedy, we have to step back into a world where the sea was still a frontier, a place of wonder and terror in equal measure. This was an age when ships were the lifelines of empires, carrying not just goods and passengers, but the ambitions of nations. The oceans were highways, but they were unlit, unpoliced, and utterly unpredictable. Sailors navigated by stars and gut instinct, trusting hand-drawn maps that often missed entire coastlines or mislabeled deadly reefs. Storms could strike without warning, and when they did, there were no distress signals, no rescue helicopters, just the desperate hope that the ship was strong enough to endure. The vessel at the heart of our story was, by all accounts, a marvel of its time. Its hull was reinforced with the latest iron plating, a cutting-edge defense against the crushing power of ice and waves. Its engines, powered by steam and sail, were hailed as the perfect balance of modern innovation and tried and true tradition. Passengers marveled at its lavish interiors, crystal chandeliers, mahogany paneling, even electric lighting in some cabins. To board this ship was to step into the future, and yet, for all its grandeur, it carried the same vulnerabilities as every other ship of the era: lifeboats. Only enough for a third of those on board, watertight compartments, a new idea hastily added as an afterthought. The prevailing attitude was one of blind confidence. If the ship was big enough, strong enough, surely it was safe enough. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a reflection of the times. Shipbuilders competed for prestige, not safety ratings. Insurance companies cared more about cargo than crew. And passengers, lulled by the promise of luxury, rarely asked how many lifeboats were on board. The sea had always been dangerous, but progress had created an illusion of control. After all, if a ship could cross the Atlantic in record time, what could possibly go wrong? But the ocean never cares for human pride. Beneath the glittering surface of this golden age of sail lurked dangers no one wanted to acknowledge. Icebergs drifted silently into shipping lanes, their bulk hidden below the waterline. Rogue waves, once dismissed as sailors' myths, could rise without warning, taller than the ship itself. And when disaster struck, the protocols were laughably outdated. Distress flares were often mistaken for celebration fireworks. Nearby ships might ignore cries for help, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks. This was the world our ship sailed into, one where technology had outpaced caution, where tradition clashed with innovation, and where the price of progress was paid in lives. Every voyage was a gamble, and the house always won. Little did anyone know, this ship's final journey would be the catalyst that shattered that illusion forever. The disaster wouldn't just expose flaws in a single vessel, it would rip open the entire industry's blind spots, forcing a reckoning with truths too long ignored. The age of complacency was about to end, and the sea, as always, would have the last word. The ship's final voyage began like so many others, with celebration and confidence. Crowds gathered at the docks, waving handkerchiefs as the vessel pulled away, its polished brass gleaming in the sunlight. Among the passengers were families seeking new beginnings, businessmen carrying contracts that could make or break fortunes, and even a famous opera singer traveling to her next performance. The crew, a mix of grizzled veterans and eager young deckhands, went about their duties with practiced ease. Everything seemed perfect, but hidden beneath this ordinary departure were the first threads of a tragedy waiting to unfold. One passenger, a school teacher named Elena Hart, kept a diary that would later become a haunting record of those final days. Her entries start with cheerful observations about the ship's grandeur, the polished staircases, the orchestra playing each evening, but slowly, a subtle unease creeps in. She notes how the crew seemed dismissive of storm warnings, joking about a bit of rough weather. Another passenger, a ship's engineer named Robert Clark, scribbled technical notes in the margins of his logbook. His handwriting grows increasingly frantic as he documents strange vibrations in the hull, something he called an uneven distribution of weight. These weren't just random complaints, they were early red flags ignored in the rush to maintain appearances. The ship's mission was routine: transport cargo and passengers across the Atlantic with record-breaking speed. The company had promised efficiency, luxury, and above all, safety. But behind the scenes, pressure from investors meant corners were cut. Lifeboat drills were cancelled to avoid alarming passengers. Extra cargo, poorly secured, shifted dangerously in the hold during storms. And then there was the route itself, an aggressive shortcut through known ice fields, chosen to shave hours off the journey. The captain had protested, but orders from headquarters were clear: stay on schedule no matter what. As the days passed, the weather turned. Fog rolled in so thick the lookout could barely see the bow of the ship. Ice warnings from other vessels piled up in the wireless room, but the overworked radio operator, juggling passenger telegrams, set many aside. Then came the night of the disaster. The temperature plummeted, the sea grew eerily calm, a deceptive lull before the storm. Passengers retired to their cabins, unaware that just ahead, an ice field loomed in the darkness. The lookout, his eyes strained from hours of staring into the fog, never saw it coming. The collision was less a crash than a shudder, a deep, groaning scrape along the hull. At first, many thought it was nothing. A steward reassured a nervous passenger that it was just a propeller issue, but below deck, the truth was far worse. The ice had torn open a series of gashes, the water rushing in faster than the pumps could handle. The engineer's earlier warnings about the hull's weakness proved horribly accurate. Within minutes, the ship began listing, its compartments flooding one after another. Panic set in as passengers, many still in nightclothes, stumbled into the corridors. The crew, trained for orderly evacuations, now faced chaos. There weren't enough lifeboats. The ones they had were launched half empty in the confusion. In the end, the wreck wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was a perfect storm of human error, arrogance, and bad luck. The ship that had been called unsinkable slipped beneath the waves in mere hours, taking with it hundreds of lives and the unshakable faith in progress that had built it. But from those dark waters would rise something unexpected, proof that even the greatest tragedies can force humanity to grow. The survivors' stories, the recovered logs, the ignored warnings, they would all become the foundation for a new era of safety, one where the sea's lessons were finally heard. The first warning came as a whisper, a faint creak of metal, barely audible over the howling wind. Then the ship shuddered violently, throwing passengers from their beds. In the engine room, men scrambled as seawater burst through the hull, their shouts drowned by the roar of incoming waves. On deck, the storm had transformed into something monstrous. Rain fell sideways, stinging like needles, while waves the height of buildings slammed into the listing vessel, each impact sending splintered wood flying. The captain barked orders, but chaos had already taken hold. Lifeboats meant for 60 were loaded with 20, then launched into the blackness before anyone could protest. Below deck, third-class passengers, many non-English speakers, fought through flooded corridors, their path blocked by locked gates installed to keep steerage separate from the wealthy above. A steward named Thomas Whiteley later described the scene in a letter to his sister. The lights flickered, then failed entirely. Women clutched babies to their chests, wading through waist-deep water. One man handed me his wedding ring, begging me to give it to his wife if I made it out. I never saw him again. In the wireless room, the operator tapped out distress signals until the power died, his final message a fragment. Sinking fast, for God's sake, Comp. The ship's death throes were both swift and agonizing. As the bow plunged downward, the stern rose like a grotesque monument, propellers glinting in the moonlight. Survivors recalled the unbearable sound, metal groaning, glass shattering, and beneath it all, a chorus of screams. Then silence. The sea swallowed the wreck whole, leaving only scattered debris and the distant wails of those left bobbing in the freezing water. But the horror wasn't over. Lifeboats drifted aimlessly, their occupants too terrified to row back for survivors. One woman described the sound of voices fading one by one. At first, they cried for help. Then just whimpers, then nothing. Dawn revealed the full cruelty of the night, a calm sea littered with bodies in life jackets, their faces frozen in disbelief. A rescue ship arrived hours too late, its crew weeping at the sight. This wasn't just a shipwreck, it was a reckoning. Every ignored ice warning, every skipped lifeboat drill, every locked gate, they collided that night into a single, devastating truth: the sea forgives no arrogance. And as the survivors shivered under blankets, their hollow eyes told a story no courtroom ever could. The disaster had ended, the awakening had just begun. For decades, the ship existed only in whispers, a ghost story told in maritime museums and sailors' taverns. Then, in the late 20th century, technology finally caught up to legend. A team of oceanographers, armed with side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles, began combing the seabed where the ship was last seen. The sonar painted a picture of the ocean floor in eerie detail, revealing ridges and valleys no human eye had ever witnessed. But it was a shadow, an unnatural shape jutting from the sediment, that made the team hold their breath. As the robotic cameras descended, their lights cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The ship's bow, its iron hull now draped in corals, its name still faintly visible beneath centuries of rust. The lead scientist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, described the moment in her journal. "We weren't just looking at a wreck, we were staring through a window into history." The discovery shattered assumptions. The ship hadn't broken apart on the surface, as survivors had claimed. Instead, it had plunged nearly intact to the seafloor, resting at a depth where pressure would have crushed most submarines. The team's ROV, a sleek machine fitted with robotic arms, carefully brushed sediment from the deck, revealing personal artifacts, a child's toy, a pocket watch stopped at the exact time of the sinking, even a pair of spectacles perched on a rusted railing as if their owner had just set them down. But the real revelation came when they explored the cargo hold. Nestled among crates of spoiled goods was a sealed strongbox, its contents preserved by the cold, oxygen-starved water. Inside, they found the ship's logbook, its pages miraculously intact. The entries contradicted official reports, detailing ignored ice warnings and rushed repairs. Nearby lay another surprise: blueprints for a revolutionary hull design, never implemented, that might have saved the ship. These weren't just relics, they were evidence, proof that the disaster could have been prevented. News of the discovery sent shockwaves through the maritime world. Historians pored over the artifacts while engineers studied the wreck's condition, learning how materials degraded in deep water. Families of the victims, some unaware their ancestors had been aboard, wept at the sight of recovered belongings. The ship had finally given up its secrets, but it had also done something more profound. It forced the world to remember. The wreck wasn't just a grave, it was a teacher, its lessons echoing across generations, reminding us that progress without caution is just another kind of shipwreck. The artifacts pulled from the wreckage weren't just objects, they were voices from the past, each one telling a story the ocean had kept secret for generations. Take the pocket watch recovered from the debris field, its hands forever frozen at 2:17 in the morning. That single timepiece painted a chilling picture, the exact moment the ship's grand staircase flooded, when passengers scrambling upward suddenly found themselves climbing into a watery tomb. Nearby, divers found a leather suitcase miraculously intact, its contents preserved by the cold depths. Inside were a bride's lace wedding gown, never worn, and a ticket for a honeymoon cabin. The groom's body was later identified among the wreckage, still clutching a photograph of his fiancée in one hand. Then there were the more mundane items that somehow cut deeper, a chef's ladle resting near the galley, as if dropped mid-meal, a deck of playing cards fanned out across a silt-covered table, frozen in someone's abandoned game. These weren't relics behind museum glass. They were fragments of interrupted lives, proof that real people had laughed, worked, and dreamed aboard this ship until the sea claimed them. Perhaps most haunting was the collection of children's toys discovered near what had been the third-class dining area. A wooden spinning top, its paint still bright. A porcelain doll with one shoe missing, and a small tin music box, its mechanism so well preserved that when conservators carefully wound it, the faint notes of a lullaby still tinkled out, a melody some child had fallen asleep to on their final night. But the artifacts that truly rewrote history came from the ship's bridge. The compass, its glass shattered but needles still pointing north, proved the navigation equipment had failed hours before the collision. The recovered logbook pages, their ink blurred but legible, contained frantic last entries about ice sightings the crew had dismissed. And then there was the ship's wheel, wrenched violently to one side in a last-ditch effort to avoid disaster. These weren't just tragic mementos, they were evidence, contradicting the official narratives that had blamed the tragedy solely on nature's fury. The cargo hold yielded its own revelations. Crates marked machine parts contained experimental watertight doors never installed. Barrels of wine meant for New York high society still sat stacked neatly, their contents now black sludge. And beneath them all, the most unexpected find of all, a sealed metal tube containing blueprints for a radical new lifeboat design, submitted by an unknown engineer and apparently filed away without review. Every artifact whispered the same terrible truth: this hadn't been inevitable. The toys, the watches, the half-written letters, they all pointed to a catastrophe that could have been avoided had anyone listened. The sea hadn't just taken these objects, it had preserved them as witnesses, waiting for the day humanity would finally hear their testimony. The ship's demise wasn't just a tragedy of weather or human error, it was a failure etched into its very bones. When naval engineers finally examined the wreckage, they found something chilling. The hull, celebrated as cutting edge, had been fatally thin in key areas. The iron plating, designed to impress investors with its sleekness, buckled under pressure like tin foil. Bulkheads meant to contain flooding stopped short of the upper decks, creating a deadly domino effect as water spilled unchecked from one compartment to another. One maritime historian described it as a floating paradox, strong where it didn't matter, weak where it counted most. Doctor, Liam Carter, a ship structural specialist, reconstructed the disaster using modern simulations. His findings were damning. The hull's rivets, cheap wrought iron instead of stronger steel, popped like buttons under stress, he explained, and those watertight compartments. They were more like colanders with unsealed passageways for crew convenience that became rivers of death. The ship's design prioritized luxury and speed over survival, with grand staircases that funneled water vertically and lifeboats bolted down so tightly they couldn't be launched quickly. But the most shocking revelation came from the cargo manifests. The ship had been overloaded, its weight unevenly distributed to fit extra crates of luxury goods. This raised the waterline, exposing weaker hull sections to collision damage. "It's like driving a car with the doors half open," said Carter. "You might get away with it until you don't." The disaster exposed a culture of reckless innovation. Shipbuilders, racing to outdo competitors, treated safety features as optional upgrades, bulkhead height regulations. Based on outdated calculations from sailing ships, lifeboat requirements capped at absurdly low numbers because no one believed a modern ship could sink fast enough to need more. The vessel wasn't just poorly built, it was a product of its time, when profit margins drowned out caution. Yet from this failure came transformation. The wreck's blueprints became teaching tools. New laws mandated continuous bulkheads reaching all decks, double hull designs, and lifeboats for every soul on board. Naval architects began testing models in wave tanks, not just boardrooms. The sea had delivered its verdict: progress without wisdom is just another path to the bottom. And this time, the world was finally ready to listen. Among the survivors was a young deckhand named Samuel Hartley, who spent his final moments aboard the ship helping women and children into lifeboats before being swept overboard by a rogue wave. He later described clinging to a piece of driftwood for hours, listening to the screams around him fade into the storm. "The cold wasn't the worst part," he wrote in his memoir. "It was the silence afterward, knowing you were alive when so many weren't, and wondering why." Hartley would spend the rest of his life campaigning for mandatory lifeboat drills, his voice trembling at hearings as he described watching families torn apart in the chaos. Then there was Margaret Winslow, a wealthy socialite who survived by sheer chance when a crewman mistook her for another passenger and shoved her into a half-empty lifeboat. The guilt of that moment never left her. She donated her entire fortune to build maritime safety schools, insisting they teach not just navigation, but ethics, how one decision in the dark could alter countless lives. Her journals reveal sleepless nights haunted by faces she couldn't forget. The child who'd been turned away from her boat because there was no more room, the elderly man who gave up his spot with a quiet nod. But perhaps no survivor's story cut deeper than that of First Officer William Graves. The ship's senior surviving officer, Graves had been on the bridge when the collision occurred. In the decades that followed, he meticulously reconstructed the disaster's timeline, his testimony exposing the chain of errors that doomed the ship. Yet privately, he confessed to a reporter that his greatest torment wasn't the mistakes, it was the unanswerable questions. Could I have turned harder? Should I have ignored orders and slowed down? Survivors call me a hero, he said, but heroes don't carry this many ghosts. The survivors' accounts did more than fill history books, they became living warnings. A stoker named Patrick Flynn, who escaped through a ruptured coal chute, devoted his life to improving crew conditions after describing how locked doors trapped his friends below decks. A teenage bellboy, the only staff member from the wireless room to survive, campaigned for 24-hour radio monitoring after revealing how distress signals had gone unheard. Even those who never spoke publicly left their mark. Letters found in their belongings scribbled apologies to loved ones, hastily written wills on scraps of paper, were quietly displayed in maritime museums, their ink blurred by seawater or tears. What makes these stories so vital isn't just their horror or heroism, it's how they transformed grief into change. Survivors didn't just remember the wreck, they refused to let the world forget its lessons. When lawmakers debated stronger safety laws, it was their testimony that tipped the scales. When engineers designed new ships, it was their input that shaped bulkheads and lifeboat protocols. And when future disasters were averted because of those reforms, it was their legacy that whispered through the lives saved. The sea took much that night. But the voices of those who escaped, those it could never silence. The courtroom battles that erupted after the wreck were as storm-tossed as the night of the disaster itself. Lawyers clashed like rival captains, each side maneuvering through a sea of blame and denial. The ship's owners, a powerful consortium of investors, arrived with an armada of attorneys, arguing that the tragedy was an act of God, unforeseeable, unavoidable. But the survivors' and victims' families had a different story. They brought with them the ship's recovered logbooks, pages stained with seawater but still legible enough to reveal the ignored ice warnings, the rushed repairs, the lifeboats left behind to save deck space. One widow famously slammed her husband's pocket watch on the witness stand, its hands frozen at the moment he drowned. "This," she said, "is what your negligence looks like." The hearings exposed a web of corporate corner-cutting. Ship inspectors admitted they'd overlooked faulty bulkhead seals because the company had pressured them to keep things moving. The radio operator, who survived, testified that his distress calls had gone unanswered by a nearby vessel whose wireless was unmanned overnight. Most damning of all were the blueprints from the wreck, proving the ship's designers had proposed stronger hull reinforcements only to be overruled by executives who called them cost-prohibitive. What made these trials historic wasn't just the verdict, it was how they rewrote the rules of the sea. For the first time, a ship's owners were found financially liable for passengers' lives, not just lost cargo. Insurance companies, accustomed to paying pennies for human casualties, faced staggering settlements that reshaped maritime policies worldwide. The legal battles birthed the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, still the backbone of ship safety today. Its first draft included radical new requirements: enough lifeboats for every soul on board, 24-hour radio monitoring, mandatory lifeboat drills. Even the Titanic's watertight compartments, now understood as fatally flawed, were re-engineered based on lessons from this wreck. But the most lasting change was cultural. The courtroom drama dragged maritime safety into the public eye, making acceptable risk suddenly unacceptable. Newspapers splashed survivors' testimony across front pages, turning anonymous deckhands into household names. A famous cartoon of the era showed a grieving mother pointing at a ship magnate's mansion with the caption, "You built palaces on the water, but forgot the people inside them." The public outrage was so fierce that shipping companies, once untouchable, began competing over safety features instead of speed records. Yet for all the new laws and regulations, the wreck left one haunting legal question unanswered. Can you really put a price on a life? The court awarded damages $5,000 for a lost breadwinner, $3,000 for a child. But as one judge wrote in a scathing dissent, no sum can unsink that ship. No verdict can unhear those screams. The true legacy of those courtroom battles wasn't in the fines or the reforms, but in the unspoken promise that followed: remember. So we wouldn't have to learn the same lesson twice. Before the wreck, navigating the open ocean was more art than science, a dangerous dance with guesswork and tradition. Sailors relied on lead lines to measure depth, sextants to chase the stars, and paper charts so incomplete they might as well have been sketches. fog could turn a routine voyage into a deadly game of chance, with captains steering blind through ice fields or rocky coasts, trusting luck as much as skill. But when this ship went down, dragging with it hundreds of lives and a cargo of misplaced confidence, the world finally faced a hard truth. The old ways weren't just outdated, they were deadly. The disaster exposed glaring gaps in maritime navigation. The ship's recovered logs revealed the crew had been using charts that marked icebergs 50 miles off their actual position. Their sole lookout, armed with nothing but binoculars and hope, spotted the ice far too late. Even the ship's state-of-the-art compass, later recovered from the wreck, showed signs of deviation, its readings skewed by the vessel's own iron hull. These weren't isolated mistakes, they were symptoms of a system begging for reform. What followed was a revolution in how ships found their way. Within months of the tragedy, international committees mandated standardized nautical charts, updated in real time by a new network of weather stations and ice patrol ships. Lighthouse systems, once sporadic and dim, were overhauled with brighter lenses and synchronized foghorns that could guide vessels through the worst conditions. But the most transformative innovation came from an unlikely source: radio. The ship's distress calls, unheard by nearby vessels, spurred the development of continuous wireless monitoring. Soon, every major ship carried dedicated radio operators, and coastal stations bristled with antennas, creating a safety net of sound across the silent sea. The wreck also accelerated advancements in echolocation. Engineers, inspired by reports of survivors hearing the iceberg scrape moments too late, began experimenting with underwater sound pulses. By the 1930s, these experiments had evolved into sonar systems capable of detecting hidden hazards miles ahead. Even the humble lifeboat saw radical changes, equipped with distress beacons and waterproof navigation kits, turning what had once been floating coffins into vessels of real hope. Perhaps the most profound shift, though, was cultural. Navigation was no longer the domain of individual captains interpreting the stars. It became a collaborative science, with ships sharing weather data, iceberg sightings, and corrected charts in an unprecedented global exchange. The sea, once a solitary frontier, had become a community, and every innovation, every new protocol carried the same unspoken dedication: never again. The wreck had torn apart the old world of navigation, but from its depths rose something stronger, a system where technology and teamwork could finally match the ocean's merciless scale. Before the waves closed over the ship's deck that night, lifeboats were little more than maritime theater props to reassure passengers, not tools meant to be used. Most ships carried barely enough for half their occupants, if that. Crews treated them as cumbersome clutter, bolted down so tightly they often couldn't be launched in time. Drills were rare, and when they did happen, they were performances for show, with sailors going through motions they'd never tested in real chaos. The assumption was simple: if a ship was modern enough, it wouldn't sink. Lifeboats were just a formality, like carrying an umbrella you never expected to open. Then came the wreck. Survivors described scenes of pure bedlam: lifeboats launched half empty because no one knew how to lower them quickly. Women and children were left behind not out of malice, but because the crew had never practiced evacuating under pressure. Some boats capsized during lowering, their mechanisms rusted from neglect. Others dangled uselessly as panic-stricken passengers fought over seats. The ship's designer later admitted in court that the lifeboat count had been calculated based on weight capacity, not lives saved. "We never imagined a scenario where they'd all be needed at once," he confessed, a statement that would haunt maritime history. The outcry was immediate and global. Newspapers printed diagrams showing how more boats could have fit on deck. editorial cartoons mocked ship companies for valuing crystal chandeliers over life-saving equipment. But the real change came from the survivors themselves. A young stewardess who'd watched families torn apart in the scramble for boats testified before Parliament with a simple demand: never let another soul be lost because we couldn't be bothered to practice. Her words sparked the first international lifeboat regulations, requiring enough vessels for every passenger and crew member, plus extras. Drills evolved from scripted formalities into rigorous surprise exercises. Crews now train for scenarios once considered unthinkable: nighttime evacuations, storm conditions, even abandoning ship onto ice floes. Modern lifeboats are no longer wooden dinghies but sealed, unsinkable pods with supplies for days. Perhaps most crucially, they're mounted on slides that can deploy in minutes, a direct response to that night's fatal delays. The ripple effects went deeper than hardware. The wreck exposed how class divisions had literally cost lives. Third-class passengers found staircases to the lifeboats locked or blocked. Today's evacuation plans mandate equal access for all, with crew members assigned to guide every section of the ship. Even the language changed. What were once called lifeboats are now termed survival craft, a subtle but powerful shift acknowledging their true purpose. Every time a cruise ship conducts its mandatory muster drill, or a ferry's lifeboat glides smoothly into the water during inspections, they're honoring the unlearned lessons of that night. The sea hasn't gotten kinder, but humanity, scarred by tragedy, finally stopped pretending it could outsmart the waves without preparation. Those empty seats in half-launched boats weren't just a failure of policy, they were a failure of imagination. Now, because of them, we imagine the worst, and that's why so many more have lived. The tragedy didn't just ripple across the ocean, it sent shockwaves through the halls of power worldwide. Before this wreck, maritime safety was a patchwork of national rules, often ignored in the race for profit. Ships flew different flags, followed different standards, and when disaster struck, blame dissolved into jurisdictional gray areas. But the sheer scale of this catastrophe forced nations to do something unprecedented: work together. Out of the grief emerged the first true international maritime agreement, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS. It wasn't just a set of rules, it was a promise carved from loss, a global acknowledgement that the sea's dangers respected no borders. SOLAS didn't tinker around the edges, it rewrote the book. For the first time, ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for every soul on board, a direct response to the haunting images of half-empty boats rowing away from the wreck. Watertight compartments had to extend fully to upper decks, preventing the domino effect flooding that had doomed so many. Wireless operators now stood watch around the clock, their equipment powered by backup generators, ensuring no distress call would ever go unheard again. Even the materials themselves were scrutinized. Steel rivets replaced wrought iron, hull thickness became non-negotiable, and fireproof bulkheads became standard. Every line in the new regulations traced back to a lesson written in seawater and sorrow, but SOLAS went deeper than hardware. It demanded accountability. Ships now faced rigorous inspections by neutral parties, not just the builders who had a vested interest in cutting corners. Crew training shifted from haphazard apprenticeships to certified programs, with mandatory drills that simulated real chaos rather than scripted routines. Perhaps most radically, the treaty introduced the concept of continuous voyage. A ship could be detained in any port worldwide if inspectors found violations, stripping away the old loopholes that let dangerous vessels slip between jurisdictions. The wreck's influence stretched beyond SOLAS. It inspired the International Ice Patrol, a fleet of Chinese letter ships and aircraft that still monitors icebergs along major shipping routes today. It gave birth to standardized distress signals, replacing the confusing mix of flares and flags that had failed so many. Even something as simple as the white paint now required on ship hulls, making them more visible in darkness, traces back to testimony from survivors who described losing sight of their loved ones in the moonless night. What made this legal revolution extraordinary wasn't just its scope, but its spirit. For the first time, rival nations set aside competition to prioritize collective survival. British shipbuilders adopted German steel standards. American insurers backed French inspection protocols. The treaties weren't imposed by conquest but signed in shared resolve, their clauses debated not in whispers between executives but in the full glare of public scrutiny. The sea had taught a brutal lesson. In the face of nature's indifference, solidarity was the only lifeboat that could save them all, and the proof was in the numbers. Within a decade of SOLAS taking effect, annual maritime deaths plummeted by over 60%. Ships that once would have sunk from minor collisions now limped to port thanks to reinforced bulkheads. Distress calls were answered in minutes, not hours. The rules even reshaped ship design at a fundamental level. The sleek, top-heavy luxury liners of the past gave way to broader, lower-profile vessels built for stability over speed. Yet the greatest legacy of these laws wasn't in the ships they saved, but in the mindset they instilled. The wreck had exposed a terrible truth, that progress without responsibility was just another kind of wreckage waiting to happen. SOLAS turned that truth into action, proving that when humanity chooses cooperation over competition, even the deepest scars can become blueprints for a safer world. The sea would always demand its toll, but never again would it take so much so needlessly. The shipwreck didn't just sink beneath the waves, it lodged itself into the collective imagination, becoming more than a tragedy, more than a cautionary tale. It became a myth. Within months of the disaster, penny dreadfuls and sensational newspaper sketches turned the event into lurid entertainment, complete with fictionalized last words and exaggerated acts of heroism. By the time the first silent film adaptation rolled out in the early 20th century, the story had already taken on a life of its own, blending fact with folklore until the two were inseparable. But why this wreck when so many others faded into obscurity? Perhaps because it struck at the heart of humanity's oldest fear, the illusion of control. Here was a ship that symbolized progress, luxury, and human mastery over nature until nature reminded everyone who was really in charge. Literature latched onto that tension. A flood of novels used the disaster as a backdrop for exploring class divides, moral dilemmas, and the fragility of civilization. One best-selling author framed it as a microcosm of society itself. First-class passengers clinging to privilege as the water rose, crew members torn between duty and survival, immigrants in steerage fighting for a place in the lifeboats they'd been barred from. The wreck became a canvas for every social critique of the era, its real-life horrors magnified into allegory. Even poets couldn't resist. Verses poured forth comparing the ship to Icarus, to Atlantis, to the hubris of empires. The most famous, the Ballad of the Doomed Voyage, sold over 1 million copies as a broadsheet, its chorus echoing in pubs and parlors. The waves don't care how grand your name, the deep will make you small again. Film amplified the legend. Early black and white portrayals leaned into melodrama, with mustache-twirling villains and angelic victims, but as cinema matured, so did the storytelling. A groundbreaking 1950s documentary spliced survivor interviews with haunting underwater footage of the wreck, forcing audiences to confront the reality behind the myth. Later blockbusters focused on the human scale of the tragedy, the engineer who stayed below deck to keep the lights burning, the musician who played until the waves silenced his violin. These weren't just stories, they were rituals of remembrance, ensuring new generations would feel the weight of what was lost. Comparisons to the Titanic are inevitable, but the differences are revealing. The Titanic's legacy orbits around glamour and romance, the unsinkable ship meeting its poetic end. This wreck's legacy is messier, angrier. There were no star-crossed lovers here, just systemic failures and uncomfortable truths. The Titanic fascinates as a time capsule of Edwardian opulence. This disaster resonates as a mirror, reflecting how easily ambition outpaces wisdom. Even their memorials tell contrasting tales. The Titanics tend to be statues and stained glass, while this ship is often remembered with stark, minimalist monuments, twisted metal sculptures evoking the hull's rupture, or empty lifeboat frames suspended midair. Folklore, though, is where the wreck truly took on supernatural dimensions. Coastal towns spun ghost stories about a spectral ship reappearing in stormy weather, its decks crowded with shadowy figures. Fishermen claimed to hear bells tolling from beneath the waves, a superstition so persistent that marine archaeologists later discovered the ship's bell had indeed broken loose, its clapper moved by currents. The most enduring legend speaks of the lucky coin, a gold piece supposedly tossed by a doomed passenger into the sea as a plea for mercy, said to grant safe passage to whoever finds it. Treasure hunters still scour beaches after storms, hoping to spot its glint. What makes this wreck's cultural footprint unique isn't just the scale of the tragedy, but the rawness of its lessons. It's not a story about fate or bad luck, it's a story about choices. Every book, every film, every ballad circles back to the same question: how thin is the line between bravery and recklessness? Between innovation and arrogance, that's why it endures. The ship itself may rest in the deep, but its story is forever adrift in our minds, a warning etched into the tide. Not every mystery surrenders its secrets easily, and this shipwreck is no exception. Decades after the official inquiries closed their books, whispers persisted, stories that didn't quite fit the tidy narrative of human error and bad luck. Some claimed the ship was sabotaged, sunk deliberately to conceal something far darker than a simple maritime disaster. Others pointed to the odd coincidence that several high-profile passengers, including a controversial diplomat and a scientist working on classified naval technology, vanished that night. Could their deaths have been more than tragic accidents? The theories range from the plausible to the outlandish, but each one taps into a deeper truth. When the sea swallows a story whole, people will always wonder what really happened beneath the waves. One persistent rumor involves the ship's cargo manifest, which listed crates of industrial machinery destined for a secretive military port. Divers exploring the wreck decades later reported strange discrepancies. Some containers had been pried open before the sinking, their contents removed. Were they looted in the chaos, or was something removed intentionally to hide it from investigators? Even more intriguing, a recovered crew log mentioned an unscheduled stop at a remote island days before the disaster, with no explanation in the official records. Conspiracy theorists seized on this, suggesting the ship had been used to transport something illicit, and its sinking was a cover-up gone wrong. Then there's the matter of the insurance claims. The ship's owners filed for massive payouts shortly after the wreck, citing lost cargo worth a fortune. But historians digging through archives found that several high-value items, paintings, rare jewels, even a collection of uncut diamonds had been quietly removed from the manifest just before departure. Was this a clumsy attempt at fraud, or evidence that someone knew the ship was doomed and salvaged what they could in advance? The insurance adjuster who handled the case later died in a suspicious fire, his notes reduced to ash. Coincidence, or another piece of a puzzle no one was meant to solve? The most chilling theory revolves around the ship's final distress signals. Survivors reported hearing a second set of explosions after the initial collision blasts that came from deep within the hull, not from the impact. Some believe these were deliberate charges, set to ensure the ship went down fast and took its secrets with it. A retired naval engineer even claimed to have found blueprints in an old warehouse showing modifications to the ship's lower decks, including reinforced chambers that could have housed what exactly? The blueprints vanished before they could be authenticated, leaving only questions in their wake. But perhaps the most enduring mystery is the one that keeps treasure hunters diving to this day. Legends swirl around a supposed black safe bolted into the captain's quarters, rumored to contain everything from wartime intelligence files to bonds worth millions. Expeditions have searched for it, but the safe, if it ever existed, remains lost in the wreckage. Or was it recovered long ago by shadowy figures who wanted its contents to stay buried? The sea keeps its secrets well, and as long as those secrets linger, the whispers will too, because some stories refuse to sink. The wreck didn't just rewrite history books, it revolutionized how we explore the ocean's secrets. Before this disaster, underwater archaeology was little more than salvage diving, with artifacts ripped from their context and left to crumble in the open air. But the sheer scale of this ship's tragedy demanded something new, a way to study the past without destroying it. The techniques born from this wreck would become the gold standard for marine archaeologists worldwide, turning the seabed into a living laboratory where every rusted bolt and shattered teacup told a story. One of the most groundbreaking innovations was photogrammetry, a method perfected here that stitches thousands of underwater photos into precise 3D models. Researchers realized that traditional sketches and measurements couldn't capture the wreck's complexity, so they adapted camera rigs to withstand crushing depths, creating digital twins of the site down to the millimeter. These models revealed details no diver could have spotted: stress fractures in the hull, tool marks on bulkheads, even fingerprints preserved in century-old sealant. Suddenly, scientists could walk through the ship's corridors from dry land, examining angles and relationships between artifacts that would have been impossible to document otherwise. But the real game changer was how they handled the artifacts themselves. Early recovery efforts had been brutal cannons hauled up with chains, wood splintering as it dried too fast. This time, conservators pioneered electrolytic reduction, a delicate process that uses electric currents to slowly remove salt from metal objects without damaging them. A single porthole from the wreck became a test case, submerged in a chemical bath for years until its hinges moved freely again. Today, that technique saves relics from shipwrecks across the globe, from Roman anchors to World War II submarines. The ship also taught archaeologists the value of in situ preservation. Instead of stripping the wreck bare, teams left entire sections untouched, realizing that an artifact's location, a shoe near a lifeboat davit, a watch embedded in coal, could reveal more than the object itself. This shift in thinking birthed underwater museums, where divers follow guided tours past carefully preserved wrecks, their cargo and personal effects still arranged as they fell that fatal night. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy was in microbiology, when scientists noticed strange, rust-eating bacteria colonizing the wreck's iron. They initially saw it as a threat. But further study revealed these microbes could help date other shipwrecks by analyzing how quickly they consumed different metals. Now, marine biologists collaborate with archaeologists to track microbial fingerprints across the ocean floor, using them to map ancient trade routes and even locate lost vessels. The wreck's greatest gift to archaeology, though, was humility. Early divers had treated the site as a treasure trove, modern teams approach it as a grave site and a classroom. Every recovery mission now includes historians, engineers, and even psychologists to interpret not just what was found, but what it meant to those who lived it. That shift from plunder to understanding is this ship's quiet triumph. The sea took so much that night, but in return, it gave us a new way to listen to the past. Today, the wreck lies 2.5 miles beneath the surface, a ghostly silhouette encased in perpetual twilight. Unlike sunken ships that crumble into the seabed, this one remains eerily intact, its bow still proud, its decks frozen mid-collapse as if time stopped the moment the ocean claimed it. Coral blankets the railings like lace, while schools of deep-sea fish dart through shattered portholes, their scales reflecting the glow of submersible lights. But this isn't just a relic, it's a legally protected maritime memorial, designated as a grave site to honor those still entombed within its hull. Diving here requires special permits, and disturbing artifacts carries heavy penalties, a recognition that some ruins are sacred, their stories too fragile to be looted for souvenirs. Recent expeditions have captured haunting footage of the wreck in stunning detail. A 2022 robotic dive revealed a pair of leather shoes standing side by side near the stern, their owner long vanished, leaving only this silent testament to a final moment of dignity. In the grand staircase, chandeliers still dangle from collapsed ceilings, their crystals glittering like ice in the sub-spotlights. But the most poignant discovery came last year, a child's porcelain doll, its face remarkably preserved, resting against a bulkhead as if placed there yesterday. These aren't just artifacts, they're emotional landmarks, turning a steel carcass into a deeply human story. The site has also become an unexpected laboratory for marine scientists. Strange, rustical formations towering, delicate structures of iron oxide drip from the hull like molten candle wax, created by bacteria slowly consuming the metal. Researchers estimate the wreck may completely dissolve within 50 years, lending urgency to every expedition. Meanwhile, deep-sea microbes never before seen have been harvested from the ship's wood, offering clues about how life thrives in Earth's harshest environments. Even the way currents swirl through broken passageways is studied by engineers designing safer modern vessels. For those who can't descend to the depths, virtual reality now offers a way to walk the wreck's corridors. Museums worldwide host immersive exhibits where visitors can stand on the tilted deck or hold a digitized pocket watch recovered from the mud. But perhaps the most powerful tribute happens every year on the disaster's anniversary, when ships passing overhead drop wreaths into the water above the site. The flowers drift down through miles of darkness, coming to rest on the rusted bow, a fleeting touch between the living and the lost. The sea may have taken this ship, but it could never erase its legacy. Down in the quiet dark, the wreck still speaks, and the world at last is listening. The ocean has a way of turning human wreckage into something almost beautiful, a slow, silent alchemy where tragedy becomes habitat. In the decades since the ship sank, its rusted hull has undergone a remarkable transformation. What began as a jagged scar on the seabed is now a thriving metropolis of marine life, proof that nature writes its own endings to our stories. The ship's steel bones, once symbols of human ingenuity, have become scaffolding for corals that bloom like watercolor stains across the wreck. Anemones pulse where passengers once dined, their tentacles catching plankton in the same currents that once carried desperate cries for help. Even the ship's nameplate, barely legible under layers of crustaceans, now serves as a nesting ground for anglerfish, their bioluminescent lures flickering in the perpetual dark. But this rebirth wasn't immediate. In the wreck's early years, environmental costs loomed large. barrels of fuel oil trapped in collapsing storage tanks seeped into the water column for nearly a decade, leaving toxic plumes that smothered seabed organisms. Copper wiring from the ship's electrical systems leached into the sediment, creating dead zones where only the hardiest bacteria could survive. Divers in the 1960s reported eerie stretches of barren ocean floor around the wreck, where even seaweed refused to grow. It was a stark reminder: the sea might eventually forgive but never forget. The turning point came when scientists noticed something extraordinary. Deep-sea organisms, adapted to withstand extreme conditions, began colonizing the wreck's most contaminated areas. Tube worms capable of processing heavy metals clustered around the engine room. Iron-loving bacteria formed delicate rustical formations that dangled like chandeliers, slowly detoxifying the metal around them. Over time, these pioneers created conditions for more complex life to take hold. Today, the wreck pulses with biodiversity, a paradox where human-caused destruction and natural regeneration collide. Spiny lobsters patrol the promenade deck, their antennae brushing against Art Nouveau railings now crusted with barnacles. A rare species of octopus, previously unknown to science, was discovered nesting in the captain's safe, its arms coiled around the same dials meant to guard valuables. The ship's cargo, once a threat, has become part of this unlikely ecosystem. Shattered porcelain from first-class dinnerware forms miniature reefs for shrimp and brittle stars. A spilled shipment of Moroccan tiles, their cobalt glaze still vibrant, now provides shelter for juvenile FISH Chinese letter predators. Even the ship's grand piano, its wooden frame long eaten away by shipworms, supports a colony of mussels that filter toxins from the water. Marine biologists call this process wreck diversification, the moment a man-made object stops being pollution and starts being part of the food web. Yet the wreck's environmental legacy is nuanced. While it's now a sanctuary for deep-sea creatures, its presence has altered migration patterns. Some species, like the endangered Atlantic wolffish, have abandoned natural rock outcroppings to breed exclusively in the ship's sheltered holds. Conservationists debate whether this reliance on artificial structures makes ecosystems more vulnerable, or if it's simply evolution in action. One thing is certain: the ship has become a living laboratory, offering clues about how marine life adapts to human intrusions, whether we meant to leave them there or not. The most profound lesson isn't just about recovery, it's about time. The sea operates on a scale that dwarfs human lifespans. Where we see a tragedy frozen in 1912, the ocean sees a work in progress, a slow mosaic of rust and regeneration. Scientists estimate the wreck will completely dissolve within 2 centuries, its iron bones returning to the earth as plankton and anemones drift away to colonize newer ruins. But for now, it stands as a monument to resilience, both ecological and human. The same currents that carried the ship to its grave now bring nutrients to its accidental reef, ensuring that life, in all its stubborn persistence, always has the final word. The echoes of that century-old tragedy reverberate through every modern maritime disaster, revealing an uncomfortable truth: we still haven't learned all the sea's lessons. Take the Costa Concordia capsizing in 2012. A cruise ship steered recklessly close to shore, its evacuation as chaotic as the lifeboat scrambles of the past. Or the Sewol ferry sinking in 2014, where locked doors and untested safety protocols mirrored the fatal mistakes of our historic wreck. Maritime safety has come light years since that fateful night, yet these incidents prove how easily complacency creeps back in. We treat each disaster as a singular event, says naval historian Dr. Sophia Ruiz, when they're really chapters in the same story. Humanity's struggle to respect the ocean's power. modern shipping boasts technologies our ancestors couldn't dream of: satellite navigation, automated distress beacons, whole sensors that detect leaks in milliseconds. But experts warn these advances create a new danger: over-reliance. The MV Estonia, sinking in 1994, demonstrated how even advanced rowrote ferries can succumb to design flaws eerily similar to those in our historic wreck. Watertight doors failed, stability calculations proved fatally optimistic. We replaced arrogance about ship size with arrogance about technology, notes safety engineer Henrik Vogel. The ocean doesn't care if your radar is digital when your crew hasn't practiced manual steering in years. The most haunting parallel lies in the human factor. Just as our historic wreck's crew ignored ice warnings to maintain speed, modern shipping faces pressure to meet tight schedules in an era of just-in-time deliveries. The El Faro tragedy in 2015, a cargo ship sailing into a hurricane, revealed chilling audio of the captain dismissing concerns while corporate emails pushed for punctuality. Psychologist Dr. Layla Chen studies these patterns. It's not that we forget history, we convince ourselves this time is different until the waves remind us it's not. Yet progress glimmers where lessons truly took root. After the historical disaster, SOLAS mandated lifeboats for all. Today's equivalent is the International Maritime Organization's Goal Zero campaign, aiming to eliminate fatalities through predictive AI and virtual reality crew training. Where class divisions once dictated survival, modern ships now have egalitarian evacuation systems, thanks to hard-won reforms, and perhaps most crucially, the black box recorders, now mandatory on all large vessels, ensure disasters leave behind not just wreckage, but irrefutable data. The sea hasn't changed. It remains as indifferent and deadly as ever. What must evolve is our willingness to listen not just to the warnings of our gadgets, but to the whispers of history. Because somewhere beneath the waves, an old ship's bell still tolls, its message clear: safety isn't a technology, it's a culture, and that's a lesson we can't afford to learn twice. Monuments to the wreck rise from coastlines and city squares across the world, each one a testament to how grief can forge something enduring. In the bustling port city where the ship first set sail, a granite wall stretches 50 feet long, engraved with every name lost that night, not just passengers but cooks, stokers, and laundresses whose stories might have vanished with them. Visitors trace fingers over weathered letters, pausing at shared surnames, imagining whole families erased in a single hour. Nearby, a bronze statue depicts not heroes or victims, but an empty lifeboat dangling midair, its seats gaping like missing teeth, a stark reminder of how many went unfilled. Some memorials surprise with their quiet intimacy. A tiny chapel in Newfoundland houses artifacts washed ashore after the disaster, a hairbrush tangled with strands still visible, a child's leather shoe curled like a dried leaf. Locals still add to the collection, placing modern toys and notes beside the relics each anniversary. It's not a museum, explains the caretaker. It's a conversation across time. Farther south, a lighthouse converted into a memorial beams the exact number of flashes the ship's distress signal used that night, a luminous echo sent skyward every evening without fail. Annual ceremonies reveal how the tragedy transcended borders. In one coastal town, survivors' descendants float lanterns at dusk, each light representing a life saved. Another community reads the entire passenger manifest aloud, pausing after every name so the silence between echoes the absence left behind. Even schools participate. Children in Norway plant marigolds in patterns matching the ship's deck plan, their bright blooms mapping where people once stood. The most powerful tributes, though, live in actions rather than stone. Maritime museums worldwide host safety theaters, where visitors experience simulated evacuations using the ship's original protocols, stumbling through darkness to grasp why reforms mattered. A survivor's great-granddaughter leads workshops demonstrating how modern lifeboats deploy, turning her ancestors' trauma into tools that save others. And every new ship christened in certain shipyards receives a plaque made from metal salvaged from the wreck, a literal fusion of past and present sailing forward together. These memorials don't just honor the dead, they challenge the living. A plaque near the ship's home port puts it bluntly: remember their stories, then ask, would you have acted differently? The answer, written not in words but in safer ships and trained crews, is the truest monument of all. For many families, the wreck wasn't just a historical event, it was a fracture line that split their histories into before and after. Take the descendants of Elena Hart, the school teacher whose diary survived in her brother's attic for decades. Her great-granddaughter, now a marine biologist, keeps that water-stained journal in a climate-controlled case, its pages turned carefully with gloves each year on the anniversary. She wrote about the stars that last night, the descendant shares, voice thick. How clear they were. Now I study ocean conservation because of her, because the sea that took her also gave me purpose. Then there's the legacy of First Officer Graves, whose tormented letters about the disaster became a family heirloom. His great-nephew, a commercial airline pilot, carries one in his flight bag, a faded page describing the moment Graves realized the lifeboats wouldn't be enough. He wrote that the worst sound wasn't the screams, the nephew explains. It was the silence when they stopped. Before every takeoff, I read it. Reminds me that checklists aren't paperwork, they're lives. Some artifacts took darker turns. A gold pocket watch belonging to a wealthy passenger. The hands frozen at the sinking's estimated time resurfaced in the 1980s when a pawnshop owner recognized the engraved name. It had passed through black market dealers, traded as a macabre collectible until the passenger's elderly granddaughter fought in court to reclaim it. She donated it to a maritime museum with one condition: displayed face down, because no one should glorify the moment he died. Oral histories reveal even sharper contrasts. One family proudly recounts how their ancestor, a steward, saved 12 people by breaking locked gates with an axe, a heroism omitted from official reports. Another whispers of an uncle who vanished after the wreck, suspected of stealing jewels from first-class cabins during the chaos. We don't talk about him at reunions, admits a descendant. But his suitcase had enough rubies to buy a farm. Makes you wonder. The most haunting inheritances are intangible. A third-class passenger's daughter, born months after the wreck, grew up with her mother's recurring nightmare, a dream of floating doors she couldn't climb onto. That daughter's own child, now in her 90s, still startles at foghorns. It's in our bones, she says, not just grief, but the guilt of surviving when so many didn't. You don't outlive that, you just learn to sail with it. Yet from this shared trauma emerged unexpected connections. Every year, descendants gather at a tiny church in Nova Scotia where victims were buried. They exchange flowers, letters, even recipes, dishes their lost relatives might have cooked aboard ship. A great-grandson of the ship's baker brings loaves made from a salvaged ledger's recipe. A violinist plays tunes from the recovered music box. What began as mourning has become a stubborn act of remembrance, stitching families together across generations. The wreck's true legacy lies in these living threads, not just names on memorials, but the way its echoes shape choices today. A crewman's descendant serves on modern ice patrol ships. A passenger's great-great-granddaughter designs cruise ship evacuation systems. And in quiet moments, when old photographs are passed around kitchen tables, the lost still steer the course of lives they never got to see. The sea took their futures, but their stories, those refused to sink. modern technology has peeled back the ocean's shadows, allowing us to witness the ship's final hours with startling clarity. Using computational fluid dynamics, the same software that designs hurricane models, engineers have reconstructed every second of the collision in chilling detail. These simulations reveal how a series of small errors snowballed into catastrophe. The slight delay in turning the wheel, the iceberg's hidden underwater spur tearing through weaker hull sections, the flooding patterns that doomed compartments once deemed unsinkable. One virtual reenactment shows the ship's stern rising at an impossible angle, its bulkheads groaning under stresses no human eye could have calculated in 1912. It's like rewinding a nightmare, says Dr. Rachel Kim, a naval architect who led the project. We see exactly when hope was lost. Virtual reality takes this even further, plunging users into the disaster with visceral intensity. Strapping on a headset, you stand on the tilting deck as lifeboats sway wildly overhead, their davits screeching under unbalanced loads. The simulation incorporates survivor accounts so precisely that you hear panicked shouts in the exact locations they were reported, a steward yelling, "Women and children first." Near the grand staircase, a musician tuning his violin near the second-class lounge. But the true power of VR lies in testing theories. Want to know if more lives could have been saved had the ship turned left instead of right? The simulation adjusts in real time, showing how alternative decisions might have played out. Spoiler, most scenarios still end in tragedy, proving how little margin for error existed that night. The most haunting revelations come from digital twins, exact 3D replicas of the wreck that let scientists experiment without disturbing the actual site. By tweaking variables like wave height or cargo distribution, researchers discovered the ship's fatal flaw wasn't just the iceberg impact, but how uneven weight exacerbated the flooding. "We always assumed the water spread evenly," explains historian Marcus Y. But the digital twin proved it cascaded like a waterfall through specific corridors, trapping hundreds. These models also debunked myths like the long-held belief that the ship broke cleanly in two. Simulations show it fractured chaotically, with the bow's plunge creating lethal suction currents that dragged people under, a detail survivors described but experts once dismissed as trauma-induced exaggeration. What makes these tools revolutionary isn't just their accuracy, but their empathy. Thermal imaging scans of the wreck, combined with period clothing databases, let scientists calculate how long victims survived in the freezing water. The answer, an average of 22 minutes, became the basis for modern cold water immersion suits. Meanwhile, AI analysis of survivor testimonies identified evacuation bottlenecks invisible to investigators at the time, leading to smarter cruise ship stairwell designs today. Even the ship's recovered artifacts get scanned into these systems. A single rusted porthole, when digitally restored to its original position, revealed how a jammed hinge slowed lifeboat launches. Yet for all their precision, these recreations can't capture one thing: the human terror of that night. No simulation conveys the smell of salt and fear, the way a mother's hands shook as she lowered her child into a lifeboat she couldn't join. So engineers are now collaborating with psychologists, weaving emotional context into the data. One VR experience includes a moment where the screen fades to black unless you make eye contact with another passenger, a gut-wrenching nod to how many died because they couldn't bear to leave loved ones. It's a reminder that behind every pixel and algorithm are real people, their choices and sacrifices etched into history not by code but by the unforgiving sea. The tragedy didn't just ripple through history books, it seeped into the very soul of art and music, transforming grief into something achingly beautiful. Within weeks of the disaster, street musicians were already strumming mournful ballads about the ship, their lyrics scribbled on scraps of paper and sold for pennies. One of the earliest, The Sinking of the Grand Lady, became an overnight sensation, its chorus echoing through tenement halls and dockyard taverns. She was built to defy the tide, but the tide don't take no pride. These weren't just songs, they were communal mourning, a way for people who'd never set foot on a ship to weep for those lost beneath the waves. Painters, too, wrestled with the disaster's scale. Maritime artist Frederick Judd Waugh, known for his turbulent seascapes, spent months obsessively sketching the ship's final moments. His most famous work, The Last Light, shows the vessel's stern tilting toward the stars, a single lifeboat adrift in the foreground, a tiny slash of color against the consuming dark. Critics called it too raw, but the public couldn't look away. Meanwhile, modernists like Joseph Turner used abstract brushstrokes to capture the chaos, their canvases swirling with icy blues and blacks that seemed to swallow the viewer whole. The wreck's grip on creativity only tightened with time. In the 1950s, jazz composer Miles Davis recorded Deep Water, a haunting instrumental piece inspired by survivor accounts. The trumpet's wail mimics the ship's distress whistle, while the slow, sinking cadence of the bass line evokes the inevitable pull of the depths. Decades later, punk bands would flip the script, turning the disaster into a rallying cry against corporate greed with raucous anthems like White Star Lied, a scathing indictment of the shipping company's negligence. Perhaps most moving are the folk traditions that keep the story alive in unexpected ways. In Newfoundland, fishermen still sing the ballad of the iceberg each spring, their voices rising over the crash of waves as they remember the bodies recovered along their shores. A quilting collective in Liverpool stitches panels depicting the ship's passengers, their faces rendered in delicate thread, each stitch a testament to lives cut short. Even tattoo artists paid tribute, inking vintage lifeboat diagrams onto sailors' arms as talismans against similar fates. The wreck's most powerful artistic legacy, though, lies in how it forces us to confront the human cost behind the headlines. A contemporary installation at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic lays bare this truth. 322 porcelain teacups suspended from the ceiling, each one cracked in a unique pattern. Walk beneath them and the clinking sounds like distant voices rising and falling with the drafts. It's a reminder that art doesn't just memorialize tragedy, it makes us feel, across centuries, the weight of every single loss. And in that feeling, the ship's story stays achingly, urgently alive. News of the wreck exploded across continents like a distress flare in the night, illuminating just how connected the world had become. In London, the Daily Mail's headline screamed, "Ocean Monster Claims Thousands," above a blurred photo of the ship's christening, the champagne bottle on its hull now a cruel irony. Berlin's papers called it Der Untergang der Zivilisation, the downfall of civilization, while New York's Evening World printed survivor sketches so vivid readers vomited in the streets. But the most telling reactions weren't in the ink, they were in the unprecedented global response. The White House received telegrams from 17 nations within hours, while stock exchanges from Tokyo to Paris suspended trading as shipping stocks plummeted. This wasn't just grief, it was geopolitical whiplash. Diplomatic cables between Washington and London reveal frantic debates about blame, with American officials accusing British shipbuilders of criminal negligence, while British ministers privately fumed about Yankee interference. Meanwhile, Norway's government dispatched its entire ice patrol fleet to the disaster zone, an act that would birth the International Ice Patrol. Even landlocked Switzerland mourned. Zurich's newspapers listed Swiss watchmakers lost aboard, their precision instruments now ticking at the bottom of the Atlantic. Public outcry transcended borders. In Rio de Janeiro, Catholic and Candomblé priests held joint vigils, mingling rosaries with seashell offerings. Mumbai dockworkers refused to load British ships for a week, their protest banners quoting a survivor's account of locked steerage gates. The outrage grew so heated that when the ship's owner dared attend a London opera 2 months later, the audience turned their backs, an aristocratic snub that made front pages worldwide. What made this disaster different from earlier maritime tragedies was its timing. The world stood at the dawn of global media, with telegraph cables stitching continents together in real time. For the first time, a shipwreck wasn't just local news fading with the tide. It was a live event that held the planet's attention for weeks. When a memorial service in Cape Town drew 10,000 mourners, most of whom had never seen an ocean, it proved the sea's reach extended far beyond its shores. The wreck had torn open a truth the 20th century would learn again and again. In our interconnected world, no tragedy is ever truly distant. Even after a century of research and discovery, this shipwreck still guards its most tantalizing secrets like a locked strongbox on the ocean floor. One of the most persistent mysteries revolves around the passenger manifest, a document that, upon closer inspection, doesn't quite add up. Survivors spoke of a reclusive gentleman in cabin B13, a man who boarded under the name Louis Renault but left no trace in any shipping company records. Porters recalled him carrying a small, heavy case he refused to let out of his sight, while a steward's log mentioned odd requests for meals to be left outside his door. When divers explored the wreck, the cabin was found empty, its porthole pried open from the inside. Was Renault a stowaway, a thief, or something far more intriguing? The only clue, a single gold cufflink recovered from the seabed nearby, engraved with symbols that cryptographers still can't decipher. Then there's the matter of the ship's vault. Built to safeguard valuables, its steel door was found ajar during the first robotic expedition, the interior picked clean except for a handful of scattered coins. Oddly, maritime insurance records list no major deposits for that voyage, yet the ship's purser had written to his wife about a special consignment requiring extra vigilance. Rumors swirled. Was it bullion from a secret wartime transaction, sensitive diplomatic documents? The truth might lie in a fragment of ledger recovered in 2018, its waterlogged pages hinting at a last-minute cargo addition. One crate, contents unverified, for diplomatic eyes only. Whoever claimed those contents did so in the chaos of the sinking, leaving behind only a single footprint in the silt, a boot print too small to match any crew member's issued footwear. Perhaps the most haunting enigma is the Lady in Grey, a figure described by multiple survivors but absent from all passenger lists. Witnesses placed her on the aft deck as the ship went down, calmly clutching a child's doll. Some swore she stepped into the water without a lifebelt, vanishing beneath the waves without a sound. Decades later, a diver exploring the wreck's stern reported a fleeting glimpse of porcelain, a doll's face peering from a crevice, its painted eyes eerily intact. When the team returned with better equipment, the doll was gone, leaving only a debate. Was it a trick of the light, or does the wreck still hide its ghosts? These unanswered questions aren't just historical loose ends, they're invitations. Every generation brings new tools, from AI-powered sonar to deep-sea DNA analysis, each offering fresh hope of solving puzzles the ocean has kept for a century. The shipwreck's greatest lesson might be this: some stories refuse to end with the sinking. They ripple outward, waiting for the curious to dive deeper. As we surface from the depths of this story, one thing is clear. This shipwreck was more than a tragedy, it was a turning point. Its legacy lives on in every lifeboat drill conducted at sea, in every maritime law etched into international code, and in every ship designed with humility as much as innovation. The ocean may keep its secrets, but each discovery, whether a rusted pocket watch or a long-lost blueprint, pulls us closer to understanding not just what happened that night, but why it still matters today. This wreck's true monument isn't made of stone or steel. It's woven into the fabric of how we navigate the world, quite literally. Next time you see a cruise ship's evacuation map, notice how every corridor leads to safety. That's this disaster's fingerprint. When you hear a storm warning broadcast globally within minutes, that's its voice echoing across the decades. Even the smartphone in your hand owes a debt to this tragedy. The wireless revolution it sparked paved the way for the connected world we take for granted. Yet for all the progress, the sea remains unchanged, a vast, indifferent force that humbles even our brightest engineering. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. Technology can make us safer, but only wisdom keeps us alive. The wreck survivors spent their lives preaching that balance, and their urgency still resonates. In an age of AI and automation, their warnings feel newly vital. Complacency, it turns out, is the one iceberg no radar can detect. So what's left to uncover? The wreck still whispers to those who listen. Marine archaeologists now study its slow dissolution, tracking how deep sea bacteria consume iron and wood, turning tragedy into ecosystems. Historians pore over digitized survivor letters, reading between the lines for untold perspectives. And somewhere in an attic or archive, there may still lie a forgotten diary, a misplaced photograph, or a shipbuilder's suppressed memo that could rewrite the story once more. If this journey through history's depths has stirred something in you, whether anger at the avoidable losses, or at the human resilience, or curiosity about what lies beneath, you're not alone. The sea's greatest mysteries are still waiting. Ghost ships that vanish without trace, coastal legends of cities swallowed by waves, even modern disappearances that defy explanation. Share your thoughts below. Which maritime enigma should we dive into next? And don't forget to subscribe. History's hidden chapters are vast, and we've only just begun to explore. The ocean never stops whispering. The question is, will you keep